Over about the last 10 years, there's been a kind of startling expansion of big data and artificial intelligence technologies in the education sector and across teaching practices and the experiences of learners in schools and universities. Now, a lot of this started, like I say, 10, 15 years ago with data mining of the information in student information systems and in learning management systems as a way of identifying particular kinds of student behaviours that were correlated with particular learning outcomes, or monitoring students' progression from the data that was available in the system, or even predicting likely outcomes based on those behavioural and progression trails in those information systems. Now, those sort of precedents of big data and AI in education from a decade or so ago have now extended to things like AI-based adaptive learning platforms, ideas about personalized education that's tailored to the individual, and even artificial intelligence teaching and learning assistants that themselves can learn the student, sort of study the student and learn how that student, her or himself, best learns, and make predictions and recommendations to that student on the basis of its own analysis. Now, commercial companies and technology-based philanthropists very quickly jumped into this space to seek to create new products based on these new understandings of how we can use big data and AI in education. So we've seen, for example, the Gates Foundation and the Chancellor initiative in the States significantly pushing ideas about personalized education. We've seen the education company Pearson first developing its own in-house big data and data analytics expertise, creating partnerships with big technology companies like IBM with its Watson cognitive computing infrastructure. And more recently, Pearson created its own artificial intelligence tutor on a smartphone app. It's called Ada. So these are kind of new commercial developments in data and AI in education. But we've also seen government agencies take an interest in this particular space. So, for example, a couple of years ago, Ofsted, the schools inspectorate in England, announced that it was performing trials of an automated AI-based form of school inspection. This was algorithmic school inspection, where a particular algorithm was trained to be able to trawl through school data and then be able to identify any particular issues, which then the human inspector would be nudged or directed by the algorithm to go and inspect in a more embodied way by visiting the school itself. Recently, we've also heard that Ofqual, the qualifications agency, is exploring the use of automated assessment technologies to actually allow artificial intelligence to mark assignments and award grades. And these are the kinds of technologies that are being encouraged by the Department for Education in the UK under its long-term EdTech strategy. Now, these developments of big data and artificial intelligence in education, I think, raise myriad issues, many of which have been reported in previous research projects or by activists and privacy campaigners and so on. So there's the possibility that these kind of technologies produce highly reductive views of what learning is. They assume perhaps that learning only consists of what can be measured and captured in a computational system. And that leads potentially to quite robotic and standardized forms of teaching and pedagogy, teaching that conforms with the systems that determine what is going to be measured and what kind of outcomes will be produced and what kinds of assessments will be made of students on that basis. There are also clearly issues with data privacy and data protection, not least under the recently introduced European General Data Protection Regulation. There are a growing number of examples of breaches of student information, primarily from commercial platforms. There are also questions around students' rights in relation to the collection of their personal data. So students, perhaps we could say, should enjoy particular rights to protection from surveillance. A lot of these big data systems require a fairly constant form of what we would call dataveillance, data-based surveillance, a capturing of the trails and traces of all of their activities in a digital learning environment, and increasingly an attempt to capture more and more information that's gathered perhaps by the teacher and inputted into the system when the student isn't actually touching the keyboard or the mouse herself. There are questions here about the rights not to be profiled through data, to have a digital kind of data double constructed out of one's data traces, which is then used for particular forms of decision making or targeted action. And the final issue here around rights is perhaps the right not to be subjected to decisional interference, where actually decisions are made on the behalf of the student or on the behalf of the teacher by an algorithm which is purely crunching the numbers. And the final risk perhaps to mention here is the risk of potential discrimination that might emerge from biases that are encoded in the data sets that are then used to train the algorithms that make the decisions. There's the potential, if particular kind of biases are baked into these systems, to reproduce over and over again existing inequalities based on past data from earlier cohorts of students. So there's a whole bunch of existing risks and issues we need to confront, but we're also seeing a set of startling new directions in the use of big data and artificial intelligence in education too. And some of these are focused on making the body and the brain of the student seemingly machine readable. So, for example, we've seen increasing interest in the use of biometric wearables, bracelets, and so on, that can track particular signals of student engagement through nervous system sympathetic arousal. We've seen the attempt to roll out facial recognition systems, or facial biometrics, which can read and identify the face of the student, and even potentially identify again these kind of emotional signals of engagement and attention and other so-called non-cognitive skills. We've also seen a few companies and research labs and centres beginning to explore the development of neurotechnologies. So head-worn or body-worn brain-computer interfaces that can gather neural information that might be relevant to informing educators, so it's said. So there are examples of neuro headsets that can be attached to personalized learning platforms, bringing about the prospect of neuro-optimized personalized learning, where brain signals of attention or confusion or stress or engagement might then feed in to the way the personalized learning system actually adapts and responds to the individual student. And the final significant development is around genomics and the collection of students' genetic data. So just in the last few years, there's been a huge kind of flurry of interest in what can be done with huge existing genomic data sets in terms of measuring and making predictions about students' attainment and achievement. And there's a number of studies in that direction with samples of up to or just over 1 million people. These kinds of studies are leading to proposals that it might indeed be possible to tailor education based on an individual's DNA profile and based on what are called predictive polygenic scores that have been calculated through bioinformatics systems from huge genomic data sets. Now, these developments in making students' bodies and even potentially their brains machine readable are inspiring, I think, quite radically new ways of thinking about education itself. So, for example, we've seen proposals around precision education and learning engineering, where the idea is that multiple sources of data, either about the kind of cognitive processes involved in learning or the neural processes involved in learning or the non-cognitive aspects of learning, the environmental context in which learning takes place, can all be combined together to produce highly detailed models of each individual student's history in learning and then to predict their future in learning. And this leads then to particular forms of kind of intervention science in education, where those data are used to specifically target individuals for tailored and personalized teaching, but actually seeking to engineer the education process around this numerical, datafied model of the student herself. Now, at the current time, during this pandemic, some of these ideas are even being supercharged in this particular context as part of a kind of radical reimagining of education for the future at huge scale. And I think then that we need to engage a much wider set of stakeholders in a more democratic discussion about what kind of future education we really want, and what is the place, or perhaps not, of big data and AI in education in that future. Thank you.